Welcome to Seeking Delphi, episode number 64, Disrupt with Impact, with Roger Spitz. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. According to an old saw, everyone talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. These days, it seems, everybody talks about disruption in technology, business, geopolitics, and even everyday life. But can anybody do anything about it? One person who has detailed ideas on what to do about it is Roger Spitz. He's a futurist, VC, ex-M&A investment banker, and advisor to the World Economic Forum's Global Foresight Network. He expresses those ideas in his new book, Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. I spoke to him about it on the eve of its recent release. Roger, great to have you here on Seeking Delphi. Welcome.
Hey, Mark. It's brilliant to be with you and to be invited to Seeking Delphi. I love the show.
So give us like that elevator speech on who is Roger Spitz and what brings him to write something like this.
So I'm South African originally, and I've lived in a bunch of countries, today in California. And I started my career as an investment banker. I was global head of mergers and acquisitions. And I moved to San Francisco in 2017, still in investment banking, and decided to go down the rabbit hole of understanding change, complexity, systems, foresight. And for want of a better word, I kind of put that umbrella under disruption, nonlinear change, complexity, and got very interested in that. Professionalized it a few years ago and saw, for various events we'll talk about and which are well known in terms of the context, pandemics and others, an extraordinary increase in interest from all kinds of constituents in these topics. And so this is a kind of general audience book where I try to unpack the ideas around unpredictability and change.
Great. So the title of your book is Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. Well, the subtitle, anybody can understand, but what do you mean by disrupt with impact? I think, doesn't disruption always have some kind of impact?
Yeah, good question. I mean, both words are ambiguous and both words are interpreted in kind of very, very different ways. So disruption for me, I use it as systemic change. So I don't take necessarily the Silicon Valley technocentric definition, and we can unpack that a bit later as to what I mean by that and how change is different. But effectively, disruption is systemic change. That's a broad set of drivers which are not necessarily technological. And they're neutral. They're not necessarily positive or negative. It's just really some you'll be affected by, some you may be the ones driving it. And the status quo of a world is probably not something that's kind of going to help sustainable futures for humanity. So change is going to be a feature, whether you drive it or whether you're affected by it. And when you drive it, you want it to be impactful. You want it to be effective. If you're trying to change things for the better, for climate, if you're trying to address societal issues or what have you, the idea is that change for the sake of change is not necessarily effective, and some change is obviously adverse. So how do you make it impactful in the sense both of sustainability, but also more broadly effectiveness?
Okay, well, right up front, in the first chapter, I think it's the title of the first chapter in the first part, you say essentially, not essentially, but directly, that disruption has always happened, but it's different now. Could you elaborate on that? And if you have a couple of examples, the examples are always great.
Yeah, so listen, the always existed is indeed, I mean, when you look at the history of time, from writing to the discovery of the wheel to, any kind of milestone or innovation or change, printing press with the Gutenberg, these are all changes that are significant. And, one example during the pandemic, which a lot of people showed, was if you were born, I think in 1914, by the time you reached 30 years old, you'd have had 2 world wars, a global pandemic, a Great Depression, and and the impacts of those, were obviously considerable. So in that context, and of course, anybody who studies, foresight and futures, constant is a change, and the idea of change or disruption isn't anything new. Now, I see disruption in kind of three different inflection points. The first one is creative destruction. It's Joseph Schumpeter in the 1940s, 1950s. It's slightly institutional. It was used a lot after the World War. Countries kind of rebuild themselves. It brings in all kinds of innovation, and it's kind of both creative and destructive. And that's kind of at a more maybe institutional scale. And then for probably most of the world, disruption is used in the Silicon Valley sense, right? It's innovation, it's a specific technology or development or product. And it's often coined with Clayton Christensen as in disruptive innovation. And Clayton Christensen has a very specific frame where he sort of considers, okay, these are the rules which make something disruptive innovation, and these are the rules that don't. So you talked about examples. Let's take, for instance, in the Christensen language, Netflix is disruptive innovation for Clayton Christensen. Why? Because in his approach, he considers that Netflix is targeting customers that are not the core customers of blockbusters or other competitors at the time. They're people that are more savvy, that are more on the margin, on the edge, looking for novelty. But basically, by coming up with a new product for them, eventually they are very loyal. You grow, you then compete with identical products to the direct competitors, and then suddenly you have your captive audience, and a blockbuster doesn't realize what's happening to it and goes bust. Uber, for instance, for Christensen, he'd say, well, Uber, yes, it's an app, maybe it's a bit cheaper, but actually it's the same thing. The people who are looking for taxis will just simply move to Uber. It's the same target audience, it's the same market, it's just a sort of different form factor. And so in that respect, for me, that is disruption 2.0. Number one, Schumpeter is disruption 1.0, and Christensen is 2.0, because it's discrete, it's identifiable, it's replicable, it's understandable. There are rules which are very well defined as to what entails disruption or not. And the idea of disruption 3.0 and the way we use systemic disruption is that it's a constant. It's really systemic. It's not one identifiable, recurring, or episodic event. It's really a number of things, the confluence, which interact, which cascade, which create different changes, and which themselves will evolve in a way that is not well understood necessarily, and hence the idea of complexity versus a discrete, replicable understanding.
You make a statement, again, in that first part that strikes me as quite significant, and it's something that I have sensed for a long time. I've always said that economist is somebody who makes predictions about the future of the economy that are more spectacularly wrong than the rest of us. I can't remember, it might have been Atlantic Monthly. It was, somebody did a study within the last 5 years that saw that really well-educated generalists, maybe futurists, actually made better predictions about the future of the economy than very narrowly focused economists do. And we can get to more on that about the tunnel vision and silos later. But right up early in the book, you say that experts on any given subject are just not as reliable as they once were. Comment on that. I know how I feel about that, and I agree, but please.
Yeah, so let me just take a little step back, but just to make a very important distinction up front, which then frames the statements around the relevance of experts, is the difference really between complex and complicated. So indeed, in a complicated world where things are linear, where there's a range of right answers, where there are known unknowns, where you can understand cause and effect ex ante, that's fine. Experts are essential. There's miracles which come from science is able to do in terms of debilitating disease. There's incredible things in terms of, the speed with which the COVID vaccines were developed, 3D printed functional organs, putting humans on Mars or what have you. That is science. It's reliable in that complicated known unknowns and that. I think the challenge is that a lot of our world, and more so, is complex. And in that complex world of unknown, it's an emergent discovery process. It's nonlinear. Don't necessarily know ex ante the outcomes of something. It's like the difference between sending a probe on Mars and the Amazon River. If you were to kind of move a road or something in the Amazon, there's a constant flux of different drivers that are impacting each other, that are dynamic, and that is just constantly changing. And then in that complex world, which is more emergent and discovery and trial and error, that is where basically you don't have a controllable, you don't have an ordered or replicable environment. And so relying on playbooks, relying on models, relying on quantifying the unquantifiable, basically that is where the problems arise. And in addition to that, with complexity, coming back to the systemic disruption, they're playing on each other in ways that are very unpredictable and on ways where there's deep and radical uncertainty. So if you think about climate change, if you think about will singularity or superintelligence exist where computers have more than the capabilities of humans, and will you live on Mars? Will we live till 200 years? Once you take these deep uncertainties and see how they interact, you're beyond what you can do as a super forecaster or as an expert. And that's where basically you can't put a hierarchy on these possibilities. You don't necessarily have agreement on the mitigants or how to address them. They are not necessarily quantifiable. They're multiple number of variables. They're indefinite. And once you put all that together, that's where the challenges arise in terms of just relying on experts. And that's why we basically update a view of VUCA. The VUCA world, as most will know, is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And we put a term which is related to your question, which is the ability to rely less on experts, because our environment is what we call unvice. It's unknown, it's volatile, it's intersecting, it's complex and exponential. And the difference between unvice and VUCA is that idea of intersecting where things are systemic and cascading, which VUCA did not kind of comprise, and exponentiality, which is a reflection of the trajectory, the direction, and velocity of change, which again, VUCA, which was coined 50 years ago by the US military, didn't have as a sort of a fast-changing, warp speed, hyper-connected environment. And so the combination of those mean that we're in this unbiased environment, which is complex, and unbiased is the opposite of advice. So we do a play on the word, which is you need to be more reliant on yourself, you need a trial and error, you need a discovery process, you need diverse perspectives, because you can't just run a playbook or rely just on what experts tell you. For that subset of unknown unknowns, it's not a denial of science, it's really just isolating those areas which at a point in time are unknown unknowns and for which they aren't necessarily a set of answers or playbook.
In my case, you're kind of preaching to the choir. The world just changes so fast. I note that I look at some of the books on my shelf that might be about technology, that might be about foresight, and sometimes books that are as little as 3 or 4 years old seem like they're out of date already. I mean, just the pace of change is really dizzying, to say the least. One other thing you say very early in here, and this is kind of my mantra, because I'm looking to a book on how to think about the future for a broad audience. I look at what are the mistakes that people make and how do you avoid them in a broad sense. And I'm not even talking about business people. I'm talking, it's going to be for the man in the street. It could be for the blue-collar worker. And the one central thing that I think resonates throughout the mistakes that people make when thinking about the future, and you talk about that right in the first section, you say imagination above everything else. And I think lack of imagination on how things could be different, how to see they could be different, is definitely an issue. So give us your point of view on that.
No, for sure. And listen, it's interesting what you're saying here earlier about the speed of change. I mean, of course, you've been doing this for some time. You're extraordinarily qualified. You also focusing very much on deep and emerging technologies. So you have a vantage point which has a lot of intersections, of course, with these themes. And I agree with you. And it's interesting that this idea of imagination trumps everything else resonates. And listen, I'm not highlighting it because I kind of agree with that. I'm not necessarily the one who coined that. There are many people from Einstein to others that are much more, relevant, known, etc., who have thought like that. But my particular perspective on it is the following. If you take, for instance, the Fed and the US, for instance, when Yellen sort of says, didn't know what inflation would be, had no idea we couldn't control it and where it would land, and you have the highest inflation over the 50 years, the issue is really not just the one of predictability or lack of predictability or constant change. The issue is the lack of imagination, that you can actually just rely on one specific outcome to the exclusion of anything else. when you have Germany that sort of says, okay, let's predicate our entire military and defense strategy and budgets, as well as our energy security, based on the assumption that if we have a good relationship with Russia, it will sort of preserve that. Basically, it's a lack of imagination. It's a lack of imagining that anything else can happen. And even at a sort of more buzzword level, and I know people love to hate him, he's a fellow South African, but if you take Elon Musk with SpaceX and that, why was Elon able to use first principles to come up with cost-effective, commercial, reusable launchers and satellites at scale, when Boeing and Airbus haven't been able to do that for half a century? And it's a very mature industry, simply because they didn't have the imagination of thinking differently with first principles. So this idea of thinking about what if, how might we, the idea about challenging assumptions, thinking about first principles, the discontinuity from the present, all these concepts, which of course for you and for many of our listeners are going to be bread and butter, funnily enough, they're easier to sort of think about in terms of a concept. What if is not the hardest concept or word to spell in the world, but applying it and thinking about how it informs strategy, that's where basically the challenges come and the necessity arises.
I got to tell you, in terms of Elon Musk, I work for a company that makes hydrogen fuel cells and electrolyzers for NASA and for commercial space. And what I have learned, particularly from my boss and good friend Bill Smith, who's the president of Infinity Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Inc., with all his years in aerospace, is that most people take the NASA approach. Failure is not an option. And if they fail, they go run around with their hair on fire, and it takes a year or more before of trying to figure it out before they launch again. On the other hand, Musk and SpaceX, his philosophy is fail until you get it right. All right? Every time you fail, you learn something, get right back up on the horse, do it again, and lo and behold, that's why he's ahead of everybody else. There's something to failing, because particularly in a complex world, you're almost never going to get it right the first time. You said something very interesting also in that first book, and this is something that is an important subject for futurists, and maybe for letting a general audience understand how futurists work. We're very much into horizon scanning. All right. It is searching far and wide to look for early signals of change. A lot of change, the signals are there on the fringes before it launches big, but you talk about something that I think is really important: signal versus noise. As I said, as the stock market has an old saying, that there's a saying that the stock market has caused nine of the last 5 recessions, or predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions, because when there's a big drop in the stock market, people think there's going to be a recession. But we had a big one in 2022. Mostly it was a huge correction and a reaction to interest rates going up. But since then, it's been going back up. Fingers crossed, so far we don't have a recession. We maybe have a cooling economy. But in terms of signal to noise, in terms of horizon scanning, it seems to me that 90+% or more of what looks like it's a signal that could be a signal of change probably is just noise. So I hope you've got some good examples on that, because there is a lot of noise out there. There's so much out there.
Yeah, listen, it's a very good debate, I think, this, and I think the examples you gave are great, because they're very tangible, and they lead to one logical extension of those examples, which is, in the end, when one appraises that they might have been wrong, or that there were 9 estimates of recession and 5 were right, or whatever the sort of language or the numbers and that, it does imply that there is a right answer. It does imply that there is a specific outcome that can be expected. It does imply that there's a benchmark with ex post with what might have been right or wrong. And I think there are 2 aspects in what we try and do with the signals over noise. I think the first one is just simply to consider that we should evaluate signals, even though you're right. It's a difficult exercise. It's almost impossible. And if the outcome you expect from evaluating signals that you have some predictive power, then you're absolutely right. You're going to fail on that for a number of reasons, which we can talk about in a second. So the idea is, don't ignore them, qualify where they come, understand how likely they might be, see if they're confirming other things, how new they are, how compounding. All I would say that is if you had used that for COVID or the example we gave with the US, the only reason I singled out the US is because they debatably have the best supercomputers and economists in the world. So when Yellen stands up and says that, it really shows you that the world has no idea. And so I think, to your point, not only could we have kind of very clearly understood that these were not black swans and that there was some degree of understanding that was pointing to it, but if you looked at some of the signals, some of which you mentioned, like printing, paper, overvalued stocks, etc., we would see that. And I would argue that even though the market is currently going up, and I'm an ex-investment banker, I spent 20 years advising, CEOs, boards, and investors, and look at very market-driven considerations. But I honestly believe no one has any effing clue. And I think Jamie Dimon gave a very, very good quote, which was simply, at the end of the day, no one really had any idea. And for me, I would not be surprised if the stock market's got up 50%, dropped 50%, dropped 90%. I think no one just simply knows the different things that can be significant triggers. And I think once we've said all that, the important thing is really to appreciate that it's the end of trends, to appreciate that we're not looking at predictive powers. And we use a word which is meta-ruptions as to contrast from meta-trends, where the unknown unknowns, you have indeterminate uncertainties, it's novel, it's things you have to investigate, it's counterintuitive, it's emergent. And this systemic change is really, you've got to appreciate that anything that you're then hoping to have some specific outcome and rely on those outcomes for is going to be bound to failure. And in a way, we use what we call the 8 laws of disruption to define systemic disruption. And that clearly, none of those is that it's predictive. One of them is that disruption is omnipresent. It's a constant. It's systemic, and it establishes new paradigms. The effects of disruption are combinatory, not isolated. The systemic disruptions are non-linear. They have ripple effects. The disruption effects must be explored with longer time frames and extended time frames. And then the 7th one is that left unchecked, disruption can slip into irreversibility. And I forget what the 8th one is, to be honest. But the idea is that when you think about change like that, the last thing you want to do is be relying on anybody who tell you they have the answer. And I read with great interest and huge respect books like Super Forecasters. And the difference between super forecasters is that, first of all, it doesn't say that they'll predict or not. But second of all, they're looking at a specific question that has a specific answer that is determined on a specific number of variables. Will China invade Taiwan? Will whoever be elected? And there will be a right or wrong. It is a specific event, etc. And that is very different from, for instance, interest rates, because of the multiplicity of systemic changes and the way we define disruption around these events. And that's where I caution the whole, and of course I'm preaching to the converted for most of the listeners who are interested in foresight, but anytime we come back to these, stock market and getting it right, getting it wrong, we're lacking the updated understanding of what disruption and change is today.
Well, for more on that, listen to I think there have been 3 podcasts with Jim Lee, our colleague
Brilliant.
In the APF, who is a financial insurance. But, in terms of the scanning, I have actually, in what I do, and I was, because I'm only working part-time now. I've cut back to part-time. I'm going to be 74 in 3 weeks, but I was working full-time for a couple of years, and I was doing horizon scanning almost every day because I was putting out newsletters. There were so many stories coming out about hydrogen and fuel cells and renewable energy. And it's not the number of stories have gone down, is that now some of them are so repetitive or the same type of story. I'm just gleaning out the really new stuff that affects the company. But one thing that I saw, and I saw it not because any one story said it, but I put 2 and 2 together and maybe came up with 5.5, not 4, and thought outside the box and saw that the biggest issue with the potential for a hydrogen economy, and I mean a green hydrogen economy, because if we have a hydrogen economy, I mean fossil fuels are hydrocarbons. Mm-hmm. The hydrogen produces most of the energy. We've got hydrogen to process in the making of steel, in the making of ammonia for fertilizers. So we've got a hydrogen economy. But in making it green, what I felt was is that, and I saw that supply and demand were going to be out of sync for quite some time. And I've been saying that probably as far back as early 2022 to people in my company. And it's only the last 3 or 4 months, all of a sudden I'm seeing stories saying that exact thing. People have figured it out, is that, yeah, there's a lot of people that want a lot of hydrogen, but they're afraid to commit to use it until they're sure there's a supply of green hydrogen, and the people that want to make it want to be confident that there's going to be a demand before they make it. So there's pilot projects now, and it'll be a slow start, but the incentives out there. And the other one was, and this is interesting, and I discussed this with Andy Hines, who heads the Houston Foresight program, and he was a little bit horrified when I told him about one meta trend, or meta eruption, if you want to call it, in the scanning. And it's when I first started doing it, I would see 1 or 2 new market studies pop up on my internet scanning a week on what's green hydrogen market. And it was going to be the market for fuel cells, for electrolyzers, for fuel cells in a certain industry, for blah, blah, blah. And by that was mid 2021. By early 2023, late 2022, early 23, I was seeing sometimes 3, 4, 5 a day. 3, 4, 5 a day. And then by last summer, it was back down to maybe only 2 or 3 a week again. And he was horrified. And he said, "Oh, I love fuel cells." No, the market research doesn't tell you how much demand there really is. It tells you how much demand there is for market research studies. And what I think is the big bump in the Gartner hype cycle in 2021, and all the investing drove a lot of different companies to put out market research studies. I think the market got oversaturated with, in my opinion, it got oversaturated with research studies, but also the VCs, they were either invested or they had the research they needed that they didn't have to keep updating twice a year, or a lot of the investors realized it's going to take a little longer than we thought to get into sync. So that hopefully resonates with the same kind of theme of what you're saying. So you do have a section on tools. I don't know how much we want to get into that, because we want readers to go out and read about tools specifically for dealing with disruption. And that's kind of the end of part 1 of the book. But maybe you could give us a couple of examples of tools for dealing with disruption without, giving away the whole farm, so to speak.
No, fair enough. And listen, the discussion we've just had and the interesting anecdotes you've given are fascinating and directly linked to these tools, right? And the fact that one might consider that change is a constant, and that you can't the idea of meta eruptions, or the 8 features of disruption, and the fact that they cascade and it's emergent, etc. It doesn't necessarily mean that the signals and evaluation that horizon scanning is diminished from value. So those are tools which are very important. The only thing, coming back to our discussion on imagination or the Fed or whatever, is when you rely exclusively on a specific outcome from that kind of analysis. Now, obviously, for us in the Foresight field, we wouldn't. It informs a broader set of scenarios and other things. But having spent some time with VCs, in fact, I'm a partner in a VC fund investing in the future of mobility. I'm also an LP and an investor with Skydeck here in Berkeley. And I spend a lot of time, and it's interesting when you look at these ideas of change and the tools to sort of think about change. Despite it being completely unpredictable, the interesting thing is that change is slow. We know that. We know that transformative change can be sort of deceptively slow, but inflection points cascade very quickly. And one of the tools we have is, how do you sort of anticipate those inflection points? It doesn't necessarily mean that you predict them. And what I've attributed to it, when you look at a lot of the devices in the 90s and precursors to the iPads and the iPhones and all that, there's certain milestones which build on each other, which mean that there's a sudden inflection point. And the examples you gave are extraordinarily interesting, because I call that the inflection paradox. And this is one of the biggest tools for sort of anticipating inflection points. And I'll just mention it quickly because it's evocative, and I think it will resonate with you because it ties in with some of the things you mentioned from your own deep tech expertise. And the inflection paradox is the following. It's basically 2 features which are well understood to a degree in their own right, but together they're paradoxical and cause the mind to kind of just blank out. And the first one is Amara's law. So many of us will know Amara. He was one of the, presidents and founders of the Institute for the Future. And there are many variations of this idea. But the idea is the following. You tend to overestimate the initial innovation or technology early on, but underestimate its impact later. So that's kind of fine. But then at the same time, you have exponentiality. Now, exponentiality is very different because exponentiality is, despite the noise, early developments are barely perceptible. So even explosive growth kind of only becomes apparent over time. However, longer term, we completely underestimate the dramatic effects because we're not capable to think like that. Think COVID or anything that's exponential. Now, what happens with the combination of the two, and I'll give one or two concrete examples, or even the one you mentioned is an interesting one. Take the metaverse, or take, Gen AI or AI. At some point, the VCs write big checks. It's overvalued. The metaverse, people just hype it. Everybody's going to be a metaverse. What will it be called? What is the date? And they're not looking at the fundamental drivers of what is simply immersive environments, digitized environments, decentralized, virtualized environments. They need to give it a specific label, a specific date, a specific technology. And so after 3 minutes, the valuations go down, people get bored, and people are like, what is this metaverse thing? But they're not thinking about the fundamental of immersion and some of the features which could entail the metaverse and the building blocks which allow the metaverse to scale in real life. They're not thinking about those because they get bored of it because of Amara's law. They're overestimating it. Meanwhile, some of the early elements or signals of exponentiality around immersion are not necessarily being registered. When you have brands like LVMH or others that are starting to sell more through virtual elements than IRL, etc., new generations and other things which we kind of don't notice. And the combination of the two means that you just ignore the hype, you get bored of it after 10 minutes, the VCs wasted their billions, fine, too many research reports, and then you assume whatever, and then next thing you know, a bunch of exponential things you don't notice at first, and then suddenly they hit you. But the reality is that once you understand that mechanism and the contradictions in those, and you sort of observe them and understand the paradox of them being combined, you pay attention differently. And once you're asking yourself, what is the data, what does metaverse look like, and what's the value, of course you're going to mess up and you're going to be caught short from the inflection paradox. And I think that is effectively one of the biggest tools we try and bring, is to kind of unpack that, understand how to look at things in a sort of separate way and how they might combine without trying to sort of predict or anticipate in too much of a granular manner, but look at the more fundamental drivers of those.
Yeah, well, in terms of that, and of course you're describing the classic Gartner hype cycle, which in hydrogen and fuel cells has happened 2 or 3 times. It's probably happened 2 or 3 times in artificial intelligence. It's starting to have some teeth now, but it's still got overhyped and came down. But nothing is more classic, of course, than the whole .com bubble around the turn of the millennia, where literally there were companies that went public with a .com, with a name and a website that had no plan for even how they were going to derive revenue, having any revenue, that got billion-dollar valuations. And yet out of that, and prices crashed, but some of the ones that crashed, like Amazon, turned into trillion-dollar titans. People didn't see Facebook or eBay or Amazon emerging out of that. All they saw was, oh my God, this great new system for communication and sharing and whatever. Part 2, one of the things you talked about in there that's interesting is what you call the next chapter of digital disruption. Give us a little talk about that. That just sounds interesting to get your perspective on the next chapter of digital disruption. Is it all about artificial intelligence or quantum computing? What else is out there?
Well, it's actually linked to what you just mentioned around the bubble. And the difference with the Gartner cycle when we're looking at things like this as the fundamental drivers is that they're looking more at the convergence and at the level of certain technologies. And so when people looked at the bubble, they weren't looking at the fundamentals around what eventually led to app stores and to computers being in a phone and to some of these more fundamental things. And the same thing happens with what I call the next phase of digital disruption, because digitization is now premature. It doesn't mean that every company is fully digitized, but effectively anything that can be virtualized, digitized, decentralized, or will be, and it's just a question of time. And so the initial phase is convergence. People are obsessed with what's converging, but that's just basically combining technologies or digitizing. And then you're looking at intersection. So what value chains are shifting? You know, when a chip is 80% of the value of a car or the operating system of a car, basically what happens is that you have intersecting fields and changes in the value chain, which is different from just convergence. And what we look at in the sort of next stage of digital disruption is beyond the convergence and just the intersection and the changes in the value chain. We look at the emergence and the creation of new fields where you can't actually define a field. It's no longer just a chip that's running a car or a medical, what is it when you're printing when you're 3D printing a heart? What is it when you're using CRISPR, or you have a company like Ginkgo Bioworks, which is effectively a horizontal platform for cell programming? Or when you have biomimicry, which develops, 3D printed bioreactors? Is that energy? Is that healthcare? Is that medical? Is it industrial? Is it technology? Is it AI? Or when you have a company like Notco in Chile, which does alternative protein, it's an algorithm. And so effectively, the way we focus in that chapter is to sort of say, don't think of just the convergence of the digitization or the things that are sort of the obvious flying car or whatever sort of ridiculous kind of, obvious convergences or intersections and changes in value shifts. But think about what is emerging, what new fields that you can't put in a box, that you may not be able to define, are basically taking shape. And that is basically the chapter and the focus of that section. And we give, dozens of examples to illustrate that. And they're not just to be clear, they're not just sort of exciting random tech. They're really things that put into question the filter of looking at the world through isolated, discrete industries or sectors as something separate. Even the concept alone of looking at a specific industry is obsolete under the frame which we present.
One last interesting question here. I did a 4-part series on artificial intelligence, and it seems to be coming into at some point into almost every podcast I'm doing these days. But I think in your third part, I think it's right there in the title, you talk about artificial intelligence and perhaps other technologies as decision-making tools in a very disruptive world. Tell us how you see that coming into play, and again, can tell some horror stories about some really bad things that ChatGPT said in its early days. But how do you foresee that moving forward as all this stuff gets better as a real tool in decision-making?
The vantage point I take, and we take at the Disruptive Future Institute, is one of thinking about the impact on human decision-making. So we look at basic AI moving up the value chain from analytics to predictive to prescriptive decision-making. And we look at machines that are learning fast. And then we look at, to our earlier discussion, when you think about what's complex, it's indeterminate, it's unknown unknowns, there isn't a playbook, you can't correlate things, it's non-linear, etc. Those features are not good for AI. Humans should be able to have critical decision-making or prescriptive decision-making in complex environments. And my concern and the way we approach this is really, and we call it tech essentialism, which is existentialism in a technological world. Today, you cannot exist in a technological without being sort of immersed by technology. And the impact on human decision-making is an area which affects agency, freedom, and choice. And so my concern is more one whereby we are delegating decision-making outcomes to machines, including in complex environments where machines should not be better than humans. We're de-skilling our own capabilities for decision-making by virtue of delegating that authority. And we're getting less versatile at sense-making and decision-making in complex environments. And so a lot of the world is focused on these false dichotomies of utopia or dystopia or existential risk, as in meaning the risk of human extinction. My real worry is not that machines become too human-like, they may or they may not, but it's that humans become too machine-like and have to rely on machines irrespective. So suddenly AR, becomes the answer to everything, irrespective of the question. And so that's, we could spend a lot of time on it, and I won't do so, unless you wish me to expand. But that's kind of the way we approach the future of AI and decision-making.
Well, Roger, thank you for all this. Just quickly tell us about the availability of your book, because we would like people to buy it and read it, and most importantly, benefit from it.
Thanks so much for that, Mark. I mean, it's called Disruptive Impact. It's readily available today in most countries in the world, and print as well as Kindle. There's a dedicated website called Disruptive Impact, where there's a lot of reviews and information and videos. And touch wood, for now, it's been extraordinarily well received and reviewed. Feedback we got, including from very serious people in the Foresight, both academic and practitioner, has been very, very encouraging. And we hope it will be relevant for as many people as possible. These are very important topics, even for those who are familiar with them.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for joining us. Very good stuff here, and best of luck with the book and future endeavors.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's such a pleasure, and such a great podcast you run.
Thank you. One futurist who agrees with Roger that disruption is now a constant is yours truly. This is likely the most important time in human history to think like a futurist, but it is also likely the most challenging. Appropriately, next up on Seeking Delphi will be a talk with organizational psychologist Graham Norris on the psychology of thinking about the future. Look for it soon. As always, my technical assistant is Mohammed Maroof. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.